Have you ever looked at a news headline, seen something truly disturbing, and thought, I could never do something like that? It's a comforting thought, isn't it? We want to believe that evil is something out there, a rare anomaly far removed from who we are. But let me challenge that belief for a moment. What if I told you that you're closer to evil than you think? Devil archetype, a concept that might sound like it belongs in fictional stories or religion, but in reality, it's rooted deeply in human psychology. And when I say devil, I'm not talking about some cartoonish figure with horns and a pitchfork. This is much more nuanced, more personal, and maybe most unsettling of all, it's something we all carry within us. The devil archetype isn't about a literal monster. It's about the darker side of human nature, a side that's often hidden but always present. We all know what it's like to have these impulses, feelings, and thoughts we'd rather not acknowledge. But the real question is, how close are we to letting these impulses take control? The concept of a shadow self has fascinated philosophers, writers, and psychologists for centuries. One of the most significant figures in understanding this darker side was Carl Jung, a pioneering Swiss psychologist who spent his life studying what he called the shadow. According to Jung, the shadow is the part of us where all the aspects we'd rather deny, anger, envy, greed, and even cruelty, are stored. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." He believed that unless we acknowledge and face these darker aspects of ourselves, they end up controlling us in ways we might not even realize. Think about that for a moment. If we're not aware of our capacity for darkness, it doesn't just go away. Instead, it influences our actions from the shadows, sometimes in subtle, insidious ways. This is where the devil archetype comes in. The devil isn't some external figure forcing us into evil. It's a representation of our potential for both good and harm. It's a symbol of those darker impulses that we repress, ignore, or pretend aren't there, but are very much part of who we are. Let's take a step back and look at one of the most famous devil archetypes, Lucifer. According to tradition, Lucifer was originally one of the highest angels, the light bringer, before he fell from grace. His fall came not because he was inherently evil, but because he wanted more power. This transformation from a being of light to a figure of rebellion and darkness speaks to the complex nature of evil. Lucifer's story shows us that evil often begins not with a monstrous figure, but with someone relatable, someone who experiences pride, ambition, and frustration with limits. When we look at Lucifer, we're not just seeing a villain, we're seeing the tragic consequences of unchecked ambition and desire. And that's what makes this archetype so powerful. It's almost frighteningly human. The same theme of relatable evil runs through countless stories across cultures. Take, for instance, the classic tale of Faust, written by Goethe. In this story, Faust is a scholar who makes a pact with the devil, Mephistopheles, trading his soul for knowledge and pleasure. But Faust isn't portrayed as a villain. He's frustrated, curious, yearning for more from life, disillusioned with the limitations of human experience. This makes him sympathetic, even as he's willing to risk everything for what he desires. Faust's story is a powerful metaphor for how the devil archetype tempts us through our deepest desires. Like Faust, don't we all sometimes crave more than what life gives us? And how far might we be willing to go to achieve those desires? If we think this is all just fictional or philosophical, history gives us a more sobering reminder of the reality. From the 20th century to today, humanity saw atrocities on a scale that shocked the world. The Holocaust, Stalin's purges, and other genocides that caused unimaginable suffering. What's disturbing is that these horrors weren't committed by a few isolated villains. They were made possible by thousands, sometimes millions, of ordinary people. Hannah Arendt, a political theorist, observed this in her study of Adolf Eichmann, one of the organizers of the Holocaust. She coined the term the banality of evil to describe how ordinary people can become complicit in monstrous acts, not out of sadistic motives, but simply because they're following orders or adhering to societal norms. Arendt's insights challenge the comforting idea that evil is something out there, separate from us. Instead, it suggests that under certain conditions, evil can become disturbingly mundane. This idea, that ordinary people can commit horrific acts under the right conditions, was further explored in psychology through the famous Milgram experiment in the 1960s. Psychologist Stanley Milgram wanted to understand obedience to authority, so he conducted an experiment where participants were instructed to administer electric shocks to a person in another room. Even as the person in the other room screamed in pain, most participants continued pressing the button as long as an authority figure reassured them it was necessary. This experiment revealed something chilling about human nature. Ordinary people can inflict pain on others simply because they're told to. And it raises an uncomfortable question. How sure are we that we'd act differently in that situation? Milgram's study, and many others since, show us that humans have an unsettling capacity to follow orders, even when it means causing harm. We'd like to think we're morally superior, that we'd never harm another person just because someone told us to, but psychology tells us that, under the right circumstances, even the most compassionate among us can cross moral lines. This doesn't mean we're evil, but it does mean that the line between good and evil is more fluid than we'd like to believe. Philosophers like Nietzsche have also explored these darker aspects of human nature. Nietzsche once wrote, "He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you." Nietzsche's warning isn't just about confronting external monsters. It's about facing the monster within ourselves. When we engage with darkness, whether in others or within ourselves, it has the power to shape us. If we're not careful, we may start to resemble the very things we despise. But Nietzsche didn't suggest we should avoid confronting our darkness altogether. Instead, he argued that we should recognize it without letting it consume us. This confrontation with the abyss, or the devil archetype, isn't about giving into darkness, but about understanding it so we can master it. Carl Jung, too, believed that to grow fully as individuals, we must integrate our shadow. By acknowledging our darker impulses, we gain a more complete understanding of ourselves. Jung suggested that if we don't recognize our shadow, it doesn't just disappear. Instead, it operates unconsciously, often influencing our behavior in harmful ways. Think of it this way: the more we try to suppress our darker impulses, the more they gain power over us. This is where the devil archetype finds its real strength. The devil isn't an external force compelling us toward evil. It's a symbol of our potential for both kindness and cruelty, for both creation and destruction. By confronting and understanding our shadow, we can prevent it from dictating our actions unconsciously. This isn't just a psychological or philosophical idea. It has practical implications for our daily lives. When we encounter feelings of jealousy, anger, or resentment, it's tempting to push these feelings away, to tell ourselves, "That's not who I am." But by doing this, we risk letting these feelings control us from the background. Instead, by acknowledging them, we give ourselves the opportunity to understand where they come from and how they affect our behavior. So what's the takeaway here? If we're all closer to evil than we'd like to think, what can we do about it? The answer lies in self-awareness and choice. When we look at individuals throughout history who resisted the temptation to fall into darkness, we see a common trait: a deep understanding of their own limitations and vulnerabilities. People like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King faced hatred, oppression, and violence, yet they consciously chose a path of nonviolence. This wasn't because they lacked anger or resentment. They were deeply human, but they had the self-awareness to transform these feelings into something constructive. They faced their shadows and made the choice to respond with empathy and self-control. In the end, we all have choices to make, and the devil archetype serves as a powerful reminder of what's at stake. Yes, we have within us the potential for darkness, but that doesn't mean we're doomed to follow it. By understanding and acknowledging our shadow, we gain the ability to act consciously and compassionately, rather than letting these darker impulses dictate our actions. The unsettling truth is that, yes, we're closer to evil than we'd like to admit, but this closeness gives us the chance to make conscious choices, to understand ourselves more deeply, and to choose compassion over cruelty. So the next time you read about something horrible and feel that quick sense of separation, that sense that you could never do such a thing, take a moment to reflect. Recognize that all humans carry the capacity for good and evil, and by understanding this, we can build a foundation for true moral integrity. You're closer to the devil than you think, but by accepting that, you're also closer to becoming someone who truly understands the power and the responsibility of choice. In a world where it's easy to distance ourselves from evil, where we often think of it as something alien or monstrous, there's actually strength in admitting our own potential for darkness. This isn't about excusing harmful actions or saying that everything is relative. It's about understanding that the line between good and evil doesn't run between us and some other. It runs right through each of us. And once we see this, we can stop projecting our darkness onto others and start taking responsibility for it within ourselves. Take a moment to consider how often we see people being judged harshly, sometimes publicly shamed or even canceled for their mistakes or poor choices. Now, this isn't to say that people shouldn't be held accountable, but sometimes we forget that the potential for similar mistakes exists within us too. The more we're able to recognize our own shadow, the more compassion we're likely to have for others. Instead of seeing others as wholly good or wholly evil, we begin to see the complexity in everyone, understanding that we all have struggles, flaws, and darker impulses. Let's look at literature again for a powerful illustration of this idea. In Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, we follow the character Raskolnikov, a man who believes he's morally superior and above common ethics. He commits a murder, thinking he can justify it because he views himself as an exceptional person. But as the story unfolds, Raskolnikov's mind unravels, and he's tormented by guilt, realizing he's not as exceptional or morally untouchable as he thought. Dostoevsky explores the devastating effects of denying our own darkness, as Raskolnikov learns the hard way that no one is above the fundamental rules of human morality. His story is a reminder of what can happen when we fail to acknowledge our shadow, when we deceive ourselves into believing we're immune from the same impulses and flaws as everyone else. This brings us to another concept from Jungian psychology: projection. When we don't acknowledge our own darker qualities, we tend to project them onto others. In other words, we start seeing in others the very traits we deny in ourselves. Have you ever noticed how the things that bother us most in other people are often traits we'd rather not admit we possess? By recognizing our shadow, we can reduce this projection, leading to more honest, empathetic relationships with others. When we see someone displaying qualities we dislike, instead of reacting with anger or judgment, we can take a step back and ask ourselves if these traits might exist within us too. This also has practical implications for our social and political lives. History shows us that the most dangerous ideologies often involve dividing the world into good and evil, with ourselves firmly on the good side. When we see others as irredeemably evil or subhuman, it becomes alarmingly easy to justify almost any action against them. This is how ordinary people can be swept up into horrific acts, by convincing themselves that they're on the side of good and that their enemies are purely evil. The devil archetype warns us of the dangers of such black and white thinking. It asks us to see both sides within ourselves so that we're less likely to dehumanize others in our quest for righteousness. Psychologists call this process moral disengagement. When we see ourselves as morally above others, it's easier to justify harm. This is why accepting our own capacity for darkness can actually make us more ethical. If we recognize that we're capable of harm, we become more vigilant about our actions and motivations. We become less likely to fall into the traps of self-righteousness, arrogance, and moral superiority, and more inclined to act with humility and compassion. Now, let's consider how this might look in our everyday lives. We all experience moments of anger, jealousy, or frustration. These are universal emotions, but instead of immediately labeling these feelings as bad or repressing them, we can take a moment to observe them. When you feel a flash of anger, ask yourself where it's coming from. Often, we'll find it's rooted in fear, insecurity, or past wounds. By acknowledging these emotions and examining their sources, we can prevent them from festering in our unconscious minds and influencing our behavior in harmful ways. Jung believed that integrating our shadow is a lifelong process. It's not about defeating the devil within us or achieving a state of pure goodness. Rather, it's about achieving balance, understanding that both light and dark are part of us, and that true maturity involves navigating this complexity. Jung once said, "I'd rather be whole than good." This doesn't mean we shouldn't strive to be ethical, but it suggests that true wholeness comes from understanding all parts of ourselves, not just the parts we're proud of. So, where does this leave us? The devil archetype, unsettling as it may be, offers a profound path to self-knowledge. By recognizing our capacity for darkness, we can begin to see how it influences us, and in doing so, we can make more conscious, compassionate choices. We might never entirely rid ourselves of these impulses, but we can learn to manage them and prevent them from dictating our actions. This understanding of the devil archetype can also deepen our sense of empathy. Instead of labeling others as evil and distancing ourselves from them, we can recognize that they, too, are grappling with their own shadows. This doesn't mean we excuse harmful actions, but it does mean that we can approach others with greater compassion, seeing them as complex individuals rather than mere embodiments of good or evil. So, the next time you see someone make a mistake, rather than rushing to judge, take a moment to consider what it must be like to struggle with their own shadow. Think about the times you felt anger, jealousy, or insecurity, and acted in ways you later regretted. This reflection not only fosters empathy, but also helps us make sense of our own choices, reminding us that we're all navigating the same fundamental challenges of human nature. In the end, the devil archetype isn't just a frightening concept, it's a mirror. It reflects the parts of ourselves we'd rather not see, but must face if we want to live fully and authentically. Yes, we're all closer to evil than we might like to believe, but by accepting that, we gain the power to act with greater awareness, wisdom, and compassion. So, as you go forward, remember, the potential for darkness is within you, but so is the potential for light. You're closer to the devil than you think, but by embracing this truth, you're also closer to becoming someone who truly understands the depth of human experience. Someone who can choose empathy over judgment, compassion over cruelty, and understanding over fear. And in that choice lies the essence of what it means to be human.